Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and this is part 2 to our 3-episode series all about protein intake recommendations. In the first part of the series, we talked all about muscle protein synthesis research, and we really set the stage for what your post-workout protein intake should be, how different protein intakes post-workout specifically affect your amino acid availability in the bloodstream, and also how much is uptaken by your skeletal muscle cells, and how that actually affects your muscle protein synthesis rates. So this kind of anabolic upper limit to protein intake post-workout, that's basically what the entire first episode of this series was about. And we're going to get straight into part 2. I have no additional personal updates because I'm filming this on the exact same day that I filmed part 1. So all the personal updates are the exact same as the part 1 episode. So if you haven't listened to that, I really recommend listening to this in order because it kind of builds upon itself. I'm trying to kind of teach it exactly how it was taught to us with a little consolidation episode for our part 3, which is my personal consolidation of all the research. Because like I mentioned last episode, we had an assignment to give our own recommendation because there's no consensus, there's no right answer as to what a protein intake recommendation should be. And based on everything that we cover in both last episode and this episode, we'll be able to put it all together in the 3rd episode to come up with a legitimate, solid range of protein intake recommendations and why. And we'll refer back to all the studies that we covered, again, last episode and this episode. So this episode is all about total daily protein intake and different studies regarding what your total daily protein intake should be. And just for reference, like I said, last episode was all about specifically how much protein you should consume acutely in your post-workout bout. And this is all about how much you should be consuming throughout the entire day. And last episode, we talked about the current daily intake recommendations. We have the RDA at 0.8 grams of protein per kg of body weight, which is so low and not enough to meet all the needs of an athlete to offset amino acid oxidation, to allow for adequate substrate availability for lean body mass gain, or to repair exercise-induced damage to muscle tissue. Personally, the RDA would have me right now at my very, very small, light body weight, it would have me consuming 37 grams of protein a day, 37 grams-ish. And I consume around 145. I consume higher than the recommendations that we'll talk about, but that's just me. And we'll also see that there's no harm to going above. But the RDA is very, very low. When it comes to recommendations given by institutions specifically for athletes, like we talked about last episode, they range from about 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, but there's no consensus across institutions. And a lot of the research that those recommendations are made on are a little bit outdated, and they don't consider both the muscle protein synthetic data and the applied whole body data. So we're going to create a recommendation that considers any and all of the above. The first study that we looked at in this specific lecture is one of Dr. Campbell's favorite studies, actually. I think I have a note here in my notes that it might be his favorite study to date. It was a study he conducted at our USF Performance and Physique Enhancement Lab, and it is called The Effects of High versus Low Protein on Body Composition in Aspiring Female Physique Athletes. So they had 17 resistance-trained females, around 22% body fat, so quite lean, and the requirement for study entry was that they had to be able to deadlift at least 1.25 times their body weight. So they had to train. This was an 8-week study. They were training 4 times a week, except on weeks 4 and week 8, they were only training 2 times a week. But typically they had 2 upper body days, 2 lower body days, and they were also prescribed some high intensity interval training. It was 4 to 7 sets of 30-second sprints. And they were randomized to a high group and a low group. The high group was consuming 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. So that's a lot higher than the RDA, obviously, and also higher than any of the institution's recommendations. So this is our high protein group. It's 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. I'm going to ask that you kind of take notes of these numbers, because what's going to differentiate these recommendations and differentiate these studies is the exact protein prescription that's given per kilogram of body weight. So in this specific study, the high group was 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight, and the low protein group was told no more than 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And since they were told no more than 1.2, what they actually ended up averaging was around 0.9 grams per kilogram of body weight. So essentially they were hovering just above the RDI. And they were given no other carbohydrate, fat, or calorie recommendations. The only guideline they were given was this protein intake recommendation, and they were told, do not diet, do not try to gain. Like, the goal was just what happens when you're given a really high protein recommendation versus a pretty low limit to your protein recommendation. And since they were given no other dietary guidance, one of the data that came out of the study was, how does your total nutrition, how does your total intake, how is that affected when you're told to consume really high amounts of protein or when you're told to consume less amounts of protein? So the high group did increase their total caloric intake. They were consuming around 1,800 calories versus the low group was only consuming 1,400 calories. That's really low. But surprisingly, the low group did not naturally increase their carb and their fat intake. So one of the things Dr. Campbell anticipated going into the study was that the group that was told do not eat more than 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein was going to naturally compensate and consume more carbs and fats. But they didn't. The groups had pretty comparable carb and fat intakes. But the high group, because they were consuming more protein, actually consumed about 400 more calories than the low group. So how did this affect their body composition? The high group gained significantly more lean muscle mass, lean tissue than the low group. Over the span of these 8 weeks, they gained 4.6 pounds of lean muscle mass, of lean tissue. The low group gained 1.3 pounds. So 4.6 pounds of lean mass gain over 8 weeks, I would take that in a heartbeat. What I think is most exciting and most interesting about the results is that the high group significantly decreased their body fat. They went from 22.7% body fat to 20.7% body fat. So they lost 2% body fat and gained 4.6 pounds of lean mass while eating 400 more calories than the low group. And the low group did not significantly change their body fat at all. So the low group ate less protein, ate less calories overall at 1,400 calories, gained 1.3 pounds of lean tissue, so they did gain some muscle, but they did not change their body fat at all. Versus the group told to consume 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, this high protein group, got to eat more overall, so they got to eat about 400 calories more because they did average 1,800 calories compared to 1,400. They gained 4.6 pounds of lean tissue. That's 3.3 more pounds than the other group of lean muscle mass. And they lost 2% body fat. So the conclusion of this is that higher protein intake is beneficial to increasing lean mass, and they actually help you decrease your body fat while eating more. The high protein group gained more muscle, lost more fat while eating more. Point blank. Fire. In my opinion, this already sets the stage for okay, we already saw muscle protein synthesis data said, hey, more protein is better for muscle protein synthesis. This study is already saying, hey, more protein is better for better body composition. So is more than 2.4 grams better? So now we're going to look at studies that use higher protein intakes than 2.4. The next study that we're looking at, the next two studies I think that we're looking at are done by Dr. Antonio et al. This one specifically is called A High Protein Diet 3.4 grams per kilogram per day, combined with heavy resistance training program, improves body composition in healthy trained men and women. They had 48 resistance trained males and females, around 19% body fat, around 24 years old. It was an 8-week study where they were training 5 times a week. The training was unsupervised, but they were instructed not to do any cardio. And the subjects were randomized to the control/normal condition, which was where they were instructed to maintain their same dietary habits. So this control group, the only thing that really changed was nothing. Keep eating what you're doing and train 5 times a week. The high protein group was told to consume greater than 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So they could consume however much they wanted as long as it was more than 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And for reference, that for me would be about 140 grams of protein. So I'm currently consuming about this much. And so what they found was the high group ended up averaging 3.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And they increased their baseline data. So before the study, the participants in the high group were consuming around 2.1 grams per kilogram. And they actually increased it from 2.1 to 3.4. So this inadvertently and consequently increased their overall caloric intake. The normal group, which was told, don't change anything about your dietary habits, did accidentally increase their protein intake from 1.8 to 2.3. So essentially what we end up comparing between these two groups is 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight compared to 3.4. And so what they found in the study, when it comes to body composition, there was no difference in lean body mass gains across the two groups. So both groups gained on average about 3.3 pounds of lean muscle mass, which is honestly so good for 8 weeks. Like, what? Okay. What they found when it comes to body fat percentage, the high group lost 2.4% body fat on average, whereas the control group only lost about 0.7% body fat. So again, we're seeing this phenomenon where when you consume more protein, you do inadvertently end up consuming more calories, and that is still translating into a greater decrease of body fat because the high protein group saw greater body fat decreases in this study than the control group. And don't get me wrong, this control group was still a very high protein intake because they averaged 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's what the last study, that's around what they were doing for their high group. And that's still greater than any of the institution's recommendations and way greater than the RDA recommendation. So all in all, we're seeing this kind of phenomenon where like greater protein is giving you this ability to increase your caloric intake while decreasing your fat mass without compromising your fat mass. Like normally you think increased calories means increased fat, but not in the case of if you're only increasing your protein. And what I thought was surprising was that there was no difference in lean body mass gains between these two groups. But given that the quote unquote low group or normal group in the study was still consuming 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is still on the high end for most recommendations, I can see why that is probably around the upper threshold for lean mass gain. So if we're talking about recommendations for protein intake for just lean mass, in my opinion, which we'll talk about this in the third episode, that recommendation is going to be lower than if you want a recommendation for overall body composition improvements. Because if you just want to gain lean mass, clearly this study is showing that 2.3 grams is sufficient per kilogram of body weight. But if you want to further improve your body composition, you increase that further, you're not getting more lean mass gains, but you might actually be further decreasing your fat mass and your body fat percentage. So next study we're looking at is going even higher on the protein intake. This study, again done by Antonio et al., it was published in 2014, and it is called The Effects of Consuming a High Protein Diet, 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day on body composition in resistance-trained individuals. This study had 30 resistance-trained males and females, around 24 years old, around 16% body fat, so lean. And again, they had a control group where they were told, don't change anything. Maintain your same dietary and training habits. And the high group was told, keep your same training habits, but consume 4.4 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. And they were given whey and casein protein to help them reach that goal because that's pretty high. I mean, if I'm consuming 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, that has me at over 200 grams of protein. I don't consume over 200 grams of protein. So this to me, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is high. What they found was when it comes to the high group, they increased their protein intake from their baseline of 2.3 grams to the prescribed 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And this caused them to increase their overall caloric intake by around 800 calories a day. So the participants in this high protein group actually ended up eating around 800 more calories a day than when they started. The low group did not change their protein intake at all, and they actually ended up in a slight deficit inadvertently. Again, they were told don't change anything. What did they find? There was no difference between the groups for fat-free mass. The control group gained 3 pounds of lean mass, and the high protein group gained 4 pounds of lean mass, but the difference was not statistically significant. So around 3 to 4 pounds gained across both groups in the study, which again, for 8 weeks, I think this is pretty high. Like I'm kind of shook. They found no changes in training volume. So they did have to report their training volume, and there was no, I guess, differences in performance or in volume or in, any of that. And what they found was there was also no statistically significant difference in fat mass, but the control group on average increased 0.3 kgs of fat, whereas the high protein group had a 0.2 kg decrease in fat. The only thing is that with 30 subjects, these differences were not statistically significant. But to me, although it's not statistically significant, I think it's noteworthy that the control group tended to trend in the direction of increasing their body fat, and the group consuming 4.4 grams of protein tended to trend in the direction of actually decreasing their body fat. Again, do I have the confidence behind this, given that it's not statistically significant to say like our recommendation should be 4.4? No. And you'll come to see in the third episode that 4.4 is higher than the recommendation that I'll personally give. But I do think that it's still supporting this phenomenon that's been elucidated by the past two studies we discussed, which is greater protein actually kind of has a really great benefit on your body fat. What the authors discussed was that ultimately there was no changes in muscle mass or in fat mass between the two groups, at least not statistically significant. So the author said that it's hard to see changes in lean body mass gains if you're not changing your training program. I don't know how much I subscribe to that, but oh well. So the last study that we'll cover is a little bit different than the first three. The first three were comparing different total daily intakes. This one is actually slightly different. It's called The Effects of Protein Supplementation on Performance and Recovery in Resistance and Endurance Training by Centineo et al., published in 2018. And essentially it's asking, does adding 1 scoop of a protein supplement per day increase your lean body mass and your size? So it's kind of taking your current daily protein intake, does adding a scoop of protein on top of that change your body composition? So in this study, subjects were currently ingesting around 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And the subjects were randomized to one of 3 groups. The control group was given an extra scoop a day of a carbohydrate placebo. There was a soy dairy group that was given an extra scoop a day of a soy dairy protein. And then there was the whey protein isolate group, which was given an extra scoop of whey isolate protein a day. And this was a 12-week study. They were resistance training 3 times a week. It was supervised. And the participants in the soy dairy and in the whey protein isolate groups, so the 2 protein groups, they increased their daily protein intake from 1.3 grams to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. They did DEXA and muscle biopsies in order to collect the data. And what they found was when it comes to the DEXA scans, the soy dairy group saw a 5.23% increase in lean body mass. The whey protein isolate group saw a 4.08% increase in lean body mass, and the carbohydrate placebo control group saw a 3.4% increase in lean body mass, but that was not statistically significant. So the only statistically significant differences in lean body mass, according to the DEXA, were those who were consuming either the soy dairy protein or the whey protein isolate protein. So the other thing they looked at was, again, with that muscle biopsy that they collected, was vastus lateralis cross-sectional area, and there were no significant changes in this CSA across any of the groups. So the resistance training that they did in this specific study was full body. It was not focused on lower body. It was not focused on quads. So the training was more than just vastus lateralis, and that's the only biopsy they took. So that was a little bit of a discussion we had as to why we didn't see changes there. But again, when it comes to the DEXA, the only statistically significant differences that we saw when it comes to overall whole body lean body mass was in the groups consuming the soy dairy protein or the whey protein isolate protein. So both of them were statistically significant. Both of them were around 4 to 5% increases in lean body mass, which is pretty significant. So we've looked at 4 studies now with different daily protein intakes. And we're going to kind of summarize those. So the 2018 Campbell paper, the first one we talked about, that study found that 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day is superior to 0.9 grams per kilogram. The second study we looked at, the 2015 Antonio paper comparing 3.4 grams to 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight, found that 3.4 was not better for further increasing your lean body mass gains, but it did cause a further decrease of body fat. The third paper we looked at, the 2014 Antonio paper comparing 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight to 1.8 grams, found no additional benefit to the 4.4 when it comes to lean body mass gains or technically to body fat. But if you remember, this is the paper that found that the low protein group actually trended to increase body fat, whereas the high protein group trended to decrease body fat, but it was not statistically significant. And then this very last paper we looked at where the extra scoop of protein was added across the soy dairy and the whey protein isolate groups. So combining those two, the groups receiving protein increased their total daily protein intake compared to the control. So what this found was that 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight was better than 1.3 grams of protein at increasing your percent of lean body mass. If we're thinking about consolidating these results, which we're not going to do in this specific episode because we have a couple more studies to cover in the next episode that are slightly different angles of looking at protein research before we can kind of create a completely consolidated recommended intake. If we're looking at these, we can see just general trends that more protein is better than less protein for lean muscle mass gain up until a certain point. So you don't need to go crazy high. You don't need the 3.4, the 4.4 grams of protein in order to get further lean mass gains. But we do see that at those much higher protein intakes, we see benefits on the body fat level. And we have to remember that we're seeing these body fat improvements while these high protein participants are also consuming more calories. They're both consuming more calories than when they started, and they're also consuming more calories than the control groups they're being compared to. So that is the kind of food for thought that I'm going to leave you guys with. Because like I said, we have a couple other findings that we want to consider before we get a full total protein intake recommendation for lean body mass and body composition, which we will do in the next episode. But until then, I hope you guys have enjoyed these little split up protein intake episodes. I think they should build upon each other fairly well and kind of culminate in a really great third episode, which I will record shortly. So if you guys have any questions, as always, please DM me, email me. If you're interested in joining the world's first reverse dieting study, please email reversedietstudy@gmail.com. And until then, I will see you guys in the next one.